Hello, BookTube. Well, shipmates, we come to it at last, the end of our read-along of Moby-Dick for 2018. We left the crew of the Pequod sailing steadily south towards Japan, in the southern waters where Moby-Dick has been seen and where Captain Ahab's obsessive charting leads him to believe that he will find the whale that he believes he's destined to kill. And in the last installment that we saw, the real world tries to extend a hand to Ahab and the Pequod to stop this mad quest before it goes any further. And they fail, of course, whenever the Pequod meets another ship. Ahab has only one question: has seen the white whale? And if they say no, he has no interest in them whatsoever. And that includes the Samuel Enderby of London, the last chapter that we read, the last ship that we saw the Pequod meet, where Ahab doesn't just meet another whaling captain, he meets another whaling captain who lost a limb to Moby-Dick, and who is not obsessed and crazed about it. It's one of those see-yourself moments that in real life, maybe, if not in fiction, would have stopped someone dead in their track, but not Ahab. And these final chapters that we're reading show that more pointedly than ever. Not only does the Pequod meet a happy ship, a very happy ship, for which Ahab feels nothing but scorn, but the Pequod also meets the most heartbreaking ship of all, the Rachel, which is sweeping the ocean cautiously and carefully for a whaling boat that was pulled out of sight by a rampaging Moby-Dick, and which had on board, we learn, Captain Gardner's son. And Captain Gardner, who's from Nantucket, and keep in mind, knows Ahab. They aren't strangers. They've known each other, probably for years. Gardner begs Ahab to enlist the Pequod so that they can double their search radius, even offers to charter the Pequod for money in order to make up for the lost time of cruising, in order to search for that whaleboat and his lost son. And Ahab says no. So, not only has Ahab been a tyrannical and inhospitable captain, but now he's breaking every law of the sea, every law of God and man, on his quest for the white whale. And it's at that point that you start to feel, if you've never read this book before, I believe that it's at that point that you would start to feel that this is all one enormous tragedy, that this isn't a case of whether or not Ahab gets a whale. But we do get a couple of interesting tidbits about Ahab. Melville isn't done elaborating on him, playing with him, expanding him to the very end. We get two that struck out at me. I was curious to know your reactions, but I'll get to that at the end of the video. But the first one is that we learn something that seems utterly weird. Remember, a long time ago when we started this read-along, it seemed like Captain Peleg and Captain Bildad, it seemed like the excuses that Captain Peleg was making for Ahab seemed a little facile. Peleg had sailed with Ahab. He had known him to be an ungodly, godlike man, and says only that it was the pain of his ruined leg that had driven him temporarily out of his mind, and that sailing in the southern latitudes hunting for whales will be good for him. And you don't really believe it, not just because the dockside prophet Elijah says that it's not true, says there's so much more going on here and it's so much worse, and not also just because surely Peleg knows that he's telling less than the truth. He's not a stranger. He's down in Ahab's cabin all the time. He knows him, has worked carefully with him since he returned from his last voyage, has known him before and after his injury. In other words, all the way back at the beginning of the book, Peleg has to know that Ahab is insane. He has to know that it's dangerous to entrust a whaling vessel to this man. And in these chapters that we're reading today, we learn something. We learn that at one point, shortly after Ahab came back from his last voyage, in other words, after he had an ivory leg, he'd been found in a swoon, face down, unconscious, like dead, and that somehow a shard of his leg, his wooden leg, had pierced his groin. And we're told, Melville tells us, or through Ishmael tells us, that it was only after a very long time and with a great deal of effort that it was healed, that the whole thing was healed. And as many times as I've read that, I have no idea what that means. I have no idea what Melville wanted it to mean. And it's a weird detail to put in there at the end of the book, because Melville, again, through Ishmael, seems to imply that it was that incident that is the source of so much of Ahab's monomania. Not losing his leg, but almost himself castrating himself, with nothing to do with Moby-Dick. A very strange moment. I want to know what all of you made of it. All of you who are, the ones of you who are actually sticking around to get all this reading done. And the other moment, of course, will, if you're reading along with these chapters, will have jumped out at you. It's an incredible chapter. I want to read you just a bit of it. It's a chapter called The Symphony. It only has 2 instruments. It has Ahab and his first mate, who have the kind of human conversation they should have had before the Pequod left on its voyage. But here, at the peak of this disastrous cruise, Ahab, for some unaccountable reason, opens up and talks about himself in a way that he hasn't at all in the rest of the book, and that he doesn't afterwards. I want to read you just a bit of that, where he's talking to Starbuck, and they are comparing their lives. Ahab is nearly 60. He married at 50. He has a baby boy at home, and he knows the boy's routines well, speaks of him with affection. He's hardly ever seen the boy, but he knows when he wakes up from his nap and whatnot. And Starbuck seizes on it immediately. It says, yes, okay, you married when you were old. I married when I was young. And I also have children. Surely we can quit this whole thing. Let's just sail back to Nantucket. Surely if we have met each other on this most elemental of grounds, babies nesting back at home, then we can make peace. We can forget this madness. And Ahab, right, he cants about himself as if he weren't a different person, as if he were looking at a different person, analyzing a character on a play or whatever. And he goes, let's see here, 40 years ago, 40 years of continual wailing, 40 years of privation and peril and storm time, 40 years on the pitiless sea. For 40 years has Ahab forsaken the peaceful land, for 40 years to make war on the horrors of the deep. And yes, Starbuck, out of those 40 years I have not spent 3 ashore. When I think of this life I have led, the desolation and solitude it has been, the masoned, walled town of a captain's exclusiveness, which admits but small entrance of any sympathy from the green country without, weariness, heaviness, Guinea Coast slavery of solitary command. When I think of all this, only half suspected, not so keenly known to me before, and how for 40 years I have fed upon dry, salted fare, fit emblem of the dry nourishment of my soul, when the poorest landsman has had fresh fruit to his daily hand, and broken the world's fresh bread to my mouldy crusts, away, whole oceans away, from that young girl-wife I wedded past 50, and sailed for Cape Horn the next day, leaving but one dent in my marriage pillow. Wife? Rather a widow with her husband alive. I widowed that poor girl when I married her, Starbuck, and then the madness, the frenzy, the boiling blood, and the smoking brow from which for 1,000 lowerings old Ahab has furiously, foamingly chased his prey, more a demon than a man. Aye, what a 40 years old fool has old Ahab been. And this is a confession coming hard after a chapter in which Starbuck goes to Ahab's cabin to tell him that a routine dousing of the lower decks has revealed a great deal of oil, meaning that they have a leak in their precious cargo, the whole reason that they've sailed to the other side of the world in the first place. He tells Ahab, you need to summon the carpenter, you need to get someone down there so that we can find out where the leak is and fix it. And Ahab dismisses him, says, leak? What do I care about leaks? I'm leaky myself. Leave it, get back up on deck. And Starbuck doesn't. He steps further into the cabin and talks about being insulted, but what he really means is that it's one thing for a whaling captain to drag us after one particular whale, as long as we're killing whales along the way and filling our hold with the oil that we are all here to profit from. I guess that's an eccentricity. But a whaling captain who doesn't care that he's leaking oil is another thing altogether, something that can't be borne. And Ahab is totally intolerant of this. Actually aims a loaded musket at him and says, "Get back up on deck." And Starbuck very, very presciently says that I don't worry about the gun, and I'm not afraid of you. Let Ahab beware Ahab. And even when he's gone, even Ahab thinks, let Ahab beware Ahab. There's something in that. But it doesn't matter. Even after that confessional moment with Starbuck, where they talk about their families, it doesn't matter. Ahab says, I am Ahab, I can't be anything else. This is all writ. I have no choice. I am just a lieutenant of fate. And sure enough, since they're in the area, since the very last ship they encounter is burying people that were killed by Moby-Dick, soon enough they encounter Moby-Dick. Ahab spots him, and they lower boats, and that is where we get the lightning succession of the Chase Day 1, the Chase Day 2, and the Chase Day 3, the 3 chapters that form the whirlwind climax of this book, in which everyone is lost. Not just the crew, but the Pequod itself. Every trace except for Ishmael, who survives by clinging to the coffin that his friend Queequeg made for himself, sensing his own doom. Queequeg doesn't survive. None of the harpooners do. The mates with their children, nobody. They're all gone, except for Ishmael. He survives. But before he does, we get a moment oft parodied, oft repeated, that I want to end this out with, because it's Ahab's final words to Moby-Dick. Ahab has been told by a mystical creature that he doesn't have to worry about dying from the ocean, or even from Moby-Dick, that hemp, rope, will kill him. Ahab says, well, then what you're saying is I have to fear being hanged, and since that's not going to happen, I'm immortal. He's a little bit mordant, he's not completely serious about that, but it turns out to be true. I'm not going to, for those of you who haven't got all the way to the end, I'm not going to spoil the little detail at the very end of Moby-Dick. I will, a little bit gas-baggily, tell you that Peter Benchley loved it and mimics it in Jaws. But Ahab has a confrontation with Moby-Dick at the end, and there are lines that have been repeated and adapted many, many times, and I wanted to read them to you since we're finishing out Moby-Dick. Oh, now I feel my topmost greatness lies in my topmost grief. Ho, ho, from all your furthest bounds pour ye now in, ye bold bellows of my whole foregone life, and the top this one piled comber to my death. Towards thee I roll, thou all-destroying but unconquering whale. To the last I grapple with thee. From hell's heart I stab at thee. For hate's sake I spit my last breath at thee. And then the lone and level sand stretched far away. Then in an instant, the cyclone of the Chase Day 1, the Chase Day 2, and the Chase Day 3 is over. And there's only Ishmael bobbing on the ocean. And he is saved by the Rachel, the very ship that is still looking for the captain's son, but the very ship that Ahab denied, that just happened to stay in the area searching for her lost children, as Melville puts it. And that shipmates is the end of Moby-Dick. That is the end of the book. Ishmael is picked up. He lives to tell the tale. Everyone else dies. And that is the end of this weird novel. This last chunk, this last quarter of the book that we're reading this time around I've only scratched the surface of its strangeness. It has many strange, incantatory chapters. And unfortunately, the reading world, when this book came out in the middle of the 19th century, was not ready for a lot of what it does. A lot of the things that seem to me to be self-evident genius struck a great many of the reviewers of this book as just an author who has lost any control of his material, an incoherent mess. There were critics in both England and in America who responded right away from the beginning with, this is astonishing. This is like nothing this author has ever written. It's an amazing book, an amazing work of passion on almost a biblical level of intensity. But unfortunately, the reviewers with the widest remit of readers, the reviewers who were the equivalent of, for instance, a Michiko Kakutani damning New York Times review, Once Upon a Time if Kakutani had done that in the grand pulpit of the Sunday Times, the author's book would have sunk without a trace. And a lot of the reviewers who read this book at the beginning, and you get the strong impression when you read through the reviews that a lot of them didn't read it. A lot of them simply poo-pooed it as being a bunch of stuff and nonsense. And unfortunately, that tanked it. Now, I'm not sure that would have. Of course, you have to keep in mind the source, right? I am a book critic. So I am ascribing to the chorus of reviews that this thing got. It's the first arc of its fame, which was downward, which was bad. It failed. As a commercial entity, it failed. And it dealt a huge blow to Melville, the writer. Just a huge blow. It took him a long while after the delivery of that blow. He staggered forward in a kind of momentum of writing and thinking about the publishing world and a publishing career. But it's this book that really killed that in him. And eventually it just petered out, and he stopped writing prose for the public. And it's a perfect illustration of the ups and downs of the literary reputation that we revere this thing now. When it's often been said, and I often think of it myself, especially every time I reread Moby-Dick, if only Melville could have guessed that his book would be revered, that it would be considered by many people to be the greatest American novel ever written, and that it would be considered by many people, myself included, to be the greatest 19th century American novel ever written. If only he had known that, if there was any way for him to know that, he would still have been a cross-grained, deeply conflicted, and I think terminally unhappy man. But maybe less so. I don't know. One way or another, I know that if somehow we were able to get word back to him that this book has actually been embraced as a masterpiece, greater by far, towering over anything else he ever wrote, I feel certain that if somehow he were able to know that back in 1852, he would have kept writing novels. And who knows what they would have been like. Who knows? But anyway, we're now done. We're now at the end of our Moby-Dick read-along. And of course, if I had questions for all of you about what you thought all along, that's 100-fold true now. If those of you who have finished the book with me, I want to know, especially those of you who are reading it for the first time, what this whirlwind tour of last chapters did for you. I don't have any real pointed questions about the chase day 1, the chase day 2, and the chase day 3. I've never met any reader that those chapters didn't work on, but what about all the rest of it? At what point, reading through these chapters, especially if you'd only vaguely known about the book and hadn't read it, at what point did you get the first sense that death was hanging over everything here and everybody? That it wasn't a question of the Pequod losing Ahab overboard or whatever. But one way or another, flood the comments field with comments in the sort of an informal process that I do on this channel. If I ask a discussion question, like for instance when I made that video about bailing on books or not bailing on books, I got amazing responses from so many people. Amazing, thought-provoking responses on that video. They're still happening. And I did not respond. When I make a call for discussion, I don't wade in and respond the way I do usually in my comments field. I'm right there answering or firing back or whatever. But when it's broader discussion questions, I tend not to do that. But I want you to know that I read those discussion sections just avidly. So those of you who've been reading the book along with me for the first time or the 5th time, feel free. Let's talk in the comments field about what you made of it this time around. This was just tremendous fun for me to do a read-along of Moby-Dick. And that's going to ring out the year for read-alongs on this channel. There will be none in the month of December. And since we do read-alongs every weekend, it's going to be a little tricky to do one in January. Because we're going to miss the first weekend at least of January together. So it might be a good idea just to say that we will recommence read-alongs in February. I don't know. We'll have to see how that goes. One way or another, I want to at least make clear. First of all, I want you to tell me everything that you thought about Moby-Dick, the whole book and this last quarter of the book. And second, I want to make sure you know that your calendars are momentarily freed. You will not have a Steve Donahue read-along for the month of December. I'll join in a whole bunch of events myself as long as I'm around, which should be I don't even know, the 20th, 21st, 22nd, something like that. So we have plenty more time to talk about books, so let me hear about Moby Dick. But in the meantime, as you can see, I am now back, so I will be bombarding your queue. So beware, and I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.